Um, Good afternoon. I'm Pascal Gielen. I'm very honored to be invited by the Darmstadt Festival and also by Cohort to give a lecture. In fact, I have to be honest, I'm a layman in music. I don't know much about music, but I studied as a sociologist of culture exactly the arts and the institutional context of the arts, and I will talk about that also. And meanwhile, we studied also especially music organizations, more philharmonic organizations also. So I have a clue about music and how it is organized, but I'm not a specialist in music. I want to share you some ideas of my research about as I said, the institutional context of creative labor, and I will try to apply this also to the music field. And my research started about this issue already, I think, 22 years ago. And we started in our research asking artists almost always the same question. And this question was, how can you develop a kind of sustainable career? Later on, I made of this a sustainable life. That's why I also put here as a subtitle, Creative Life. For me, this is important because it's not only about career, it's also not only about work, it is really about how do you live as an artist today, because private and public is mixed up in creative life and creative work nowadays. And so for 20 years almost, we ask people in different ways this question, how to develop or how to keep on going and how to develop a sustainable creative life in general. And we made generalized these answers in fact in 4 spheres or 4 domains in which they gave a kind of answer to this question. And we made of this a kind of what we called an artistic biotope. So it's the biotope of what we think about what is necessary to develop on the long run, so as a sustainable career in the arts. So on the first answer of them was most always they started with, you need a good domestic context. That means you need a home. To say it more sentimental or something like that, but a home where you feel at home, that's very important. For a lot of artists, this is the private studio, where they can have rehearsals on their own, isolated almost, but also where they can have close relationships with intimates, with friends, with boyfriend or girlfriend, or with good friends. So the relations there are relations of respect. And you have there also what is for me very important, your own time and your own rituals. For example, in painting, sitting for hours for an empty canvas before you start painting. So that's one. This is a very important space for creative development, for reflecting on yourself also, about the things you make, etc. The second domain of sphere is the domain of the peers. So I take always as a kind of example for this could be an art school, the peers. The peers is where you, for the first time, get in contact with professional peers. Can be teachers, but can be also colleague students in it, curators, programmers, musicians, etc. What is typical for a peers relationship? It is hopefully also still like in the domestic space, based on respect, but it is the relation is also always based on evaluating. You know, in a professional world that you can be always evaluated by the other. For example, as a student, you can be evaluated by your teacher. Even when you go outside for a beer in a pub with him, you or her, you know immediately that everything what you said can be evaluated. It's based on knowledge, like the art historical canon, what is already done in the musical field, for example, and how do you relate to that. So it's really based on knowledge, those relationships, and it is about negotiation and discussion. It means the negotiation about what is good, what is bad, what is interesting, what is not interesting, but it is also a way of negotiation in which you try to define your own artistic identity. Classical example I always give, it comes from a teacher in an art school who told to me that he came into the studio where the artists were painting, and he said to one student, oh my God, what you are doing, Van Gogh did this already 100 years ago. And he answered the question, no, I do something else. And then the negotiation starts. It's really a negotiation with the canon, right? And with knowledge in this field. This is typical peers development. And so the domestic sphere and the peers are very important in this biotop for research and development. They are the base to create. The other sphere is the market. The market is very necessary. When you want to make money for your living and want to live from your work, you need to be in contact from market. But we define market very broad. It can be also that when you get subsidized by a government. For me, a market situation is always when what you do, your artistic practice, is translated in money. That's the basic definition for me what a market is. So you know also relationships are based on competition. Even when you work together with other musicians, you know that you can be always in competition for example, grants for a government. When you apply for that, you are in competitions with others. And when you get a grant, maybe somebody else don't get a grant. So you are always in this kind of relationship. So it's a quantitative relationship also. It's based, as I said already, on counting, but it means also you learn to, that's a very important quality of the market, you learn to count yourself. Having said this, means also that the art field is not based only on a market situation. There are always other things involved, social relationships, etc. So, and this brings me to the last sphere that a lot of artists mention when they say, how can I build up a sustainable career? It's a sphere of, I call it the civil space or the civil domain. And this is the space of representation. This means, I call it also the space where a very idiosyncratic piece of art can become culture. It means that a lot of people, and not only professionals, also laymen, but people who sometimes love art or are interested in culture, is that they say, this is ours. This is the shift from art to culture, I think. It's when people say, this is significant for us, it means something to us. So this is also very much related to a community, a collective. As we all know, for example, of the national artistic canon, for example, or the national historical canon is such a thing, that a lot of people, politicians also, of course, but also citizens, see it as something from them. Yeah, and this is a very important thing what happens in the civil space. But the civil space is also very important for artists to get a kind of more broader public support, to feel also that the things what they are doing, and not only what they are doing, but also what, for example, the whole musical field, let's call it like that, is doing, that it is important for a society. So in the civil space, you also develop a kind of, or you can get a kind of support for a musical discipline, for example, or for an art discipline in general. It is that a society appreciates that this happens, even when people don't go to it, to visit to it or to listen to music. But they can say, yes, but it is important that we have a philharmonic orchestra in Antwerp, for example. But we don't go, but I think it's relevant. And we also agree when it maybe gets subsidized, etc. We understand this. So this is civil support. So it's something else than a market relation. And this is often confused, especially in policy nowadays, where a lot of politicians in cultural policy, for example, think that they can read the public support in the civil domain based on the tickets which are sold for a museum or for a concert, etc. So, but that's again the shift from quality to quantity, and there's something in between. For example, maybe I just say something. 90% of the German population, let's say, can think that classical music is something very important for them, but only 10, maybe 5% really goes to concerts when they take place. So again, this is a huge difference. But so also in the civil space, is also the space of debate, arguing, discussion. What is the relevance? What is the cultural relevance? Does it need to be subsidized by tax money or not? This kind of discussions are important, but also really about values. Has it public value? What does it mean for us? What does a composer mean for our society? And what does her or his music mean for it? So those 4 domains, and this is for me important, all 4 are important. You need to balance always student. I said already, domestic and peers are very much important for research and development. Market and civil space are more important to show your work, to sell your work also, to make a living of it. Still one remark I wanted to make about this. Until, let's say, until the 1970s, those spheres were what sociologists call institutionally protected. That means, for example, just take the first one, the domestic sphere was institutional protected by the institution family. We all know what happened with this institution starting from the 70s. We get a lot of divorces, we get one-parent families, etc. So this institution collapses in a way. I mean, in total society. So in that sense, this protection disappeared. It evaporates. You can say the same of peers, art schools. In the art school, for example, and I come now to the second slide, the market gets in more and more. So, and this is the whole paradigm, what I call in this biotope of the creative industries, in which we see that the market takes over and tries to organize other spheres. And for me, this is as maybe as a metaphor, I understand this also as the kind of a very important quality of the market, learning to quantify, but this learning to quantify also colonizes the other spheres. So what this is doing, this creative industries, is that you learn to quantify yourself also already, for example, in the domestic sphere. I put it there, home entertainment, but we interviewed, for example, a lot of architects. We asked them what the function is of designing programs. And they said, literally, a designing program counts or pre-calculates the risks already before you are even putting something on paper, etc. So it's calculating already your creativity beforehand. And this is this typical way of quantifying creativity in the domestic sphere. You see it also in the civil space. You get more and more privatized museum, like for example, Guggenheim Bilbao is a beautiful example in the city, where of course the museum has still huge artistic quality. It shows marvelous artists, but at the same time the whole programming of the museum is calculated. For example, they know, it's in their policy plans, 80% dead artists, because otherwise we cannot attract enough visitors. So it's calculated. So they play with this also in the programming. And sometimes you see a more experimental, interesting artist, and the next month it will be, for example, David Bowie, who attracts a lot of people. So they play in the problem. So what I mean by this is in the civil space also, not only in public museums, and I think it's also the phenomenon, but I study it not much enough for typical big philharmonic orchestras. They play more and more the canon, the classical canon, to attract people. And they, of course, they also still bring sometimes more sophisticated work, or I don't say that the canon is not sophisticated, but I mean new work, or work which is more complex, or which is the typical modern classic music, for example, like Schoenberg, etc. But they know they have to be aware that they also put next to them classical canon that attract visitors again. So this is the typical creative industries attitude which comes in, and which changes also this biotope, and also which destructs, in a way, the whole, or deconstructs, I have to say, this this institutional protection of those domains. The market becomes more and more dominant. And what is interesting is, and it was already an idea of Adam Smith, by the way, that he said that when the market takes over other spheres, it can be problematic. And that's what we see nowadays. The market takes over other spheres, and it has a kind of very strange feedback on the functioning of the market itself. That means also that the market does not function anymore how it did, let's say, before the 80s, before the 1970s. For example, when you have home entertainment and you can do a lot of things at home when you think nobody sees you, you can download things illegal, for example. You can start playing also, or you can start reframing designing programs, etc. So piracy comes in, and this is of course a dysfunction of the market, piracy. What also comes in is, of course, when creative industries you get a kind of a system in which people make always more and more the same. You get this formatting, what I already mentioned in it, but also, and this is much more interesting, I think, people when you are in high competition for presenting cultural products, you always look also in what I call a horizontal way what others are doing, and you try to distinct. But when you're doing this, you are in competition with the others, so you try to distinct yourself and try to do just something else. But by doing this, looking to the others to distinct yourself, you are also very much mirroring the other. So you get a very strange system of what is called competitive isomorphism. More and more artistic products look the same and use also the same references in it. And which is, in fact, a problematic situation in which, in a market situation, in which you need to distinct from each other. When all products look the same, you get a kind of sameness, and that's problematic for a well-functioning market. The last thing is related to the cultural industries. We see more and more that markets function on monopolies. You can only function almost in this market when you have a monopoly, which deconstructs, of course, the classical functioning of a market system. Having said that, this is the situation I think we are living nowadays. This is and in which artist functions, and you need to organize yourself. And the question is then, of course, maybe a blunt question is what to do. How can you act in this? Because we see a lot of artists that they say it's not sustainable anymore. We cannot make a living of it for the long time, and we get burnouts. Literally, we interviewed a lot of artists who get burnouts, but we also what is also problematic is that when you have the feeling that you're always in competition, is that you it deconstructs in a way your possibilities to be creative. It is very strange because you, for example, you don't dare to share or to try out some new ideas because several reasons. Because other ones can steal your idea. It's a very important one. But also because of what I mentioned already, this competitive isomorphism. You want to stay in the market, so you look at others, what they are doing, you're distincting, but not tremendously distincting from others. So what to do? And artists come up themselves with a solution, what we call later on with the blunt word communism. But what is meant by that is that we see more and more citizens, and so not only artists, not only musicians, try to claim again space in the market. So they try to reorganize themselves. They try to reorganize literally their economy and how they function. For example, by, in the domestic sphere, sharing common knowledge. Wikipedia, it's a typical example in the domestic space where you can use for free things. But also in the peers, it's really, we see nowadays a tendency in at least in some art schools and conservatoriums, for example, that teachers start to talk again about politics. And I mean not by politics, party politics or something like that, but they start to think and reflect again, for example, of the idea that every artist needs to become nowadays an entrepreneur. This is a typical a way of talking to, and also that, so in this sense is, you see at least starting the discussion of can't we organize ourselves in another way, in a more collective way, for example, etc. That's for me politics. It's thinking about your own position and how you function in society, and also how you can even change in a small way, maybe in a modest way, society in your own local context, at least. And also in the market itself, we see, for example, the Creative Commons license. You see development of other exchanges than based on money. The money exchange. So money is still used. It's not that money is refused or something like that, but money is more and more used only as an exchange value between things, and not anymore to accumulate money, to make profit of it. And that's the huge difference, I think, what is happening in this common situation. And I try to explain now more what this commons is about. Because there is a lot of idealizing, for example, about this commons. But very basic commons is that you have, first of all, common wealth or a common pool resource. That means that you want to share something. Can be water, can be so natural things, but also cultural resources like language, like music, like codes, like effects, creative ideas, social relationships. So they are immaterial resources we use every day. When you say in the morning to your neighbor, good morning, you are in the commons, you're sharing something. And there is no government who says what you need to do, that you need to say good morning to your neighborhood, but there is also no exchange of money for that. So what you have here is sitting people who are very famous for the series they make on Netflix, and at the same time filmmakers, and at the same time people of the local carnival. And they discuss how to program, who has the right to use a studio, for example, in the building, who has the right to use to perform there, etc. And they need to find out every week again. So this is a way of commoning. The common pool resource is the building, of course, and the studios which are in it, and the commoners are the people who are sitting there who want to share it, and the commoning process is exactly this process of commoning. I will give at least one example of this kind of commoning practice in the music field later on. What you also need, and there I come again with the word, is communism, but I stress it very much, communism as a kind of ideology, and I see ideology here in this sense as something very positive. I mean something, you need a belief system, you need to believe in something. And that's communism stands for, and what does communism stands for? It believes very much in social relationship instead of financial relationships, that you can solve a lot of things with social interaction. But what it also sees, and this is very important for me, it sees culture at the base of a society. So not like, for example, Marx said that the production relationships and economy is the base of society. Commoners say, no, culture is the base of society. And what do I mean by that? When you see culture at the base, you can also analyze an economical system as culture. It is a way of giving meaning to trade relationships, etc. That means as you see it as that, you mean also that you can re-articulate it, that you can change it. Just the same for politics. Democracy is a cultural concept, democracy. And that means also you can re-signify. So that is what I mean by culture. Culture is not a good or bad thing. I really see it here as a kind of toolbox you can use to re-signify things. So what is commons about? I see it really as a kind of third space. Just to say, but I don't go in depth to that. Commons is something not new, so certainly nothing new. It exists before the capitalist market. Already in the 15th century, they talk about commons, and it also was there already before the state was invented. So it's certainly not something new, but it was suppressed by market mechanisms and state mechanisms. But there is still a lot of in commons, and I think there are also a lot of mixture or mixed forms of it. For example, the classical we know between the market and state is private-public cooperation, of course, PPS is called in Dutch, PPC in English. But also between the market and commons, cooperatives, where all the people who function in a market system, they sell and they make products to sell, but they are all, in a good cooperative at least, they are all the owners of the cooperative in it. And less known, but l'asilo, so in the back, the picture is a good example. You have also agreements between the state or the government and people, citizens who want to do something, who organize something. And this is the civil public cooperation, which I think, which is the way to go. In this way, I think we cannot without the market and not without the state. And the state definitely need also to regulate, for example, to safeguard the commons. But I think we need the three of them. It's also Antonio Negri and Michael Hart who say when the market tries to privatize totally the commons, also the market destructs itself. It needs the commons to, as a resource even, to function. So even it is important for the market itself that it safeguards spaces where things are traded for free, where you can try out things for free, where you can exchange ideas, for example, for free. This is a very important space. I just come up as, I think this is my last slide with some examples. This is a picture of Women's Day in Madrid. where in the context of l'Internationale, it's a huge organization of I think 5 or 7 museums in Europe. Museum of Contemporary Art in Antwerp is in it, Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven in the Netherlands is in it, but also here Reina Sofia in Madrid. And so what they try to do is to reinvent the art historical canon. For example, here, Women's Day, exactly they say, look at the history we have in our museum, and the art historical canon is called classical one, all male-based. There are almost no women, certainly when you go 20, 30 years ago. So we need to reinvent, re-articulate our own art historical history. So this is for me a typical movement that when you look at commoning praxis. I don't say those museums are organized like commons, definitely not. They're quite often quite hierarchical and even patriarchal organized in the way. But this movement, what they try to do for the collections at least, is an example of this commoning practice. And that's the example I want to say, because it's in music, it's Splendor in Amsterdam. What is interesting here also, that they are also, they're using literally commoning practices to organize themselves. Probably most of you in the public know this organization. There are 50 musicians who own this building. It's an old bathhouse in center of Amsterdam. They reshaped it as a rehearsal room, but also there are public concerts in, etc. What is for me important here is the principle is that it's not subsidized. They almost work not with the market. The only thing what they do is they, the 50 artists, they gave 1,000 euros, I think, to make the construction, and they had support of kind of, let's say, mecenat that they to start. But afterwards, nowadays, those 50 artists decide in a very democratic way how to use the space. And it's very democratic in that sense that every one of the 50 has the same time slot that they can use in the building. And what has made me curious for of all of this is those 50 never had a meeting until now. They exist already, I know, I think 8 or 9 years. The only thing what they do is to decide or they need to discuss. They have an agenda, a digital agenda, in which they can cross the days that they want to use the room or give it to somebody else to use it. It can be also the case. So that's the only thing. And what is very important in this, and this, let me think also, this could only function or can only function in my eyes when you exclude something very important in the artistic world, that is discussions about artistic quality and artistic identity. They never discuss the quality of the work. It's only about our common pool resource. We want to share this building, and that's the main thing. And we have certainly certain rules to organize this, but we exclude discussing about identity, about artistic quality in general. But that's it for me. Thank you for your attention.